Previous order, the Escort Committee will now conduct the Chief Justice of the United States to the dais to be administered the oath.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
I'm
going to do announcement here first. Senators, I attend the Senate in conformity with your notice for the purpose of joining with you for the trial of the President of the United States. I am now prepared to take the oath.
Will you place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and the laws, so help you God?
I do.
God bless you.
Thank you very much. At this time, I will administer the oath to all senators in the chamber in conformance with Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution and the Senate's impeachment rules. Will all senators now stand or remain standing and raise their right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God? The clerk will call the names in groups of 4, and senators will present themselves at the desk to sign the oath book.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.
is recognized.
Any senator who was not in the Senate chamber at the time the oath was administered to the other senators will make that fact known to the chair so that the oath may be administered as soon as possible.
The Sergeant in Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the House of Representatives is exhibiting to the Senate of the United States articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, for the information of the Senate, on my behalf and that of the distinguished Democratic leader, I'm about to propound several unanimous consent requests that will assist with the organization of the next steps of these proceedings. They deal largely with necessary paperwork incident to the trial. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the summons be issued in the usual form, provided that the President may have until 6 p.m. on Saturday, January the 18th, 2020, to file his answer with the Secretary of the Senate, which will be spread upon the Journal, and the House of Representatives have until 12 noon on Monday, January 20th, 2020, to file its replication with the Secretary of the Senate. Finally, I ask consent that the Secretary of the Senate be authorized to print as a Senate document those documents filed by the parties together to be available to all parties.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that if the House of Representatives wishes to file a trial brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 5 p.m. on Saturday, January the 18th, 2020. Further, that if the President wishes to file a trial brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 12 noon on Monday, January 20th, 2020. Further, that if the House wishes to file a rebuttal brief, it be filed with the Secretary of the Senate by 12 noon on Tuesday, January 21st, 2020. Finally, I ask consent that the Secretary of the Senate be authorized to print as a Senate document all documents filed by the parties together to be available for all parties.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that in recognition of the unique requirements raised by the impeachment trial of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, the Sergeant at Arms shall install appropriate equipment and furniture in the Senate chamber during all times that the Senate is sitting for trial with the Chief Justice of the United States presiding. The appropriate equipment, furniture, and computer equipment in accordance with the allocations and provisions I now send to the desk and ask that they be printed in the record.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment adjourn until Tuesday, January the 21st, 2020 at 1 p.m.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The Senate sitting as court of impeachment is adjourned until Tuesday, January 21st at 1 p.m.
There you have it, everybody. Exactly what we expected. The senators have been sworn in for the impeachment trial of President Donald J. Trump. That trial is going to get underway at 1 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday. That's going to be 11 a.m. right here on Fox News Now. You will be able to catch that, and here's that switch camera. Just like I told you about, we are waiting to see the senators come out. Doubtful there will be any comments now that they've officially been sworn in as jurors for this trial. That's kind of how it works. But again, we will certainly listen in and watch as they are coming out of the Senate floor, and we shall wait to see. So again, historic day, regardless of which side of the aisle you are on or your political views. Still something, this is only the third time happening in American history. Again, everyone, you are watching Fox News Now. Please like, share, subscribe. Let your friends, your family, your coworkers, your neighbors, everybody you know about us right here. I am going to clip it on YouTube, so if you happen to miss the swearing in, you can watch it as many times as you'd like and share with whomever you would like as well. Thanks for being here.